So let's talk a little bit. I mean, I know that, so you work at Unidesk,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, your presence here on the show is sort of not related to Unidesk, but more of like Ron, the guy who's been in this industry for, I don't know, 10 plus years, 15, whatever it is. And I mean, doing terminal server for 10 years, so I know your background is consulting and been a terminal server kind of VMware guy. You and I wrote a book about terminal server together in 2004. You've since written two, three, four books on VMware.
Mm-hmm.
You spent a short time at Dell, but you've been at, you spent a year at Dell. That's sort of first jump on the sort of vendor provider side. Now you've been at Unidesk for come up on 2 years now, right?
Yep. Three. It'll be three in October.
Holy moly!
Is this the longest you've been with a company?
No, I was at RapidApp for 7 years before we got bought by Glasshouse. Yeah, so I'm hoping to get 7 here. We'll see.
But kind of fill us in, because I don't know if we've actually talked about Unidesk on BrianMadden.com in the past year or so. And so maybe just kind of give a primer for those listening who are not specifically familiar with Unidesk. But then I want to sort of dig into what's changed since we last talked. And that could have been like a year ago even. I don't know.
Yeah, so we're a layering company, and layering to us and to most people that are really into VDI that pay attention to it is really kind of the next. I would say a guy at VMware told me it was the next gen of what Composer should be like. And instead of doing provisioning and applications and stuff with all these kind of point tools, we start at the OS, and instead of doing, hey, I've got this VMDK and I'm going to share it, so I've got all these Delta disks and it's block level sharing, we do it at the file system and registry level. Essentially, layering, whether it's Ringcube or us or whoever, is file system and registry virtualization, the ability to merge those and present them to Windows so it sees a C drive and it sees a registry and it just looks normal. But underneath, you have an OS layer that contains all of its file system and objects and registry entries. You have application layers that might have been built on top of the OS layer, but they're unique. They only contain their file system objects and registry entries. And then each desktop has a personalization layer that contains the things that get changed for that desktop, whether it's a profile change, whether it's a programmatic change from like antivirus, right? Pushing out a UUID to the machine, or whether it's a user installed app. And what we do is we replace those tools, like in a VMware environment, we would replace Composer. In most cases, we would replace ThinApp. And then, of course, you wouldn't need roaming profiles or RTO or anything, because we could provide persistent desktops that are sharing images and can be single image updated and all that crap, right?
So the idea or the goal of layering is the sort of user experience of persistent desktops, where a user makes a change, installs an app, what have you, and it sticks until next time they're there. But with the sort of management simplicity and storage efficiencies of this shared non-persistent desktop.
Yeah, it's kind of a merging of stateless and stateful environments.
We always wanted shared image VDI to be.
Exactly. We get a lot of people to ask us about that. Now we're going to try to take it to the next step, and we get a lot of people asking us to do some other things. But I always tell people, and I used to tell this during my demo, but I didn't come to Unidesk because of VDI. And when they first reached out to me, our chief marketing officer, Tom Rose, reached out to me a couple times. I actually blew him off. I was like, I'm not all that into VDI, whatever, dude. It's centralized desktops. But it was when I talked to Chris, the CTO, and we really dug into the technology. And one slide, he showed me the concept of, okay, if I separate these things into logical items that we can then manage independently, and I do this stuff with the user personalization layer, where I can actually control some of the data and where it lands. And the cool thing about it is I can do repairs. And he showed me the concept of, what if I had a central Windows 7 image or a central set of applications that I could push to VDI, and I could push that same image down to a desktop, and it ran there. This is, of course, was when we all thought Type 1 hypervisors were right around the corner. Now I've got an IT platform where I can manage desktops, laptops.
Do we lose Jim?
The central VDI images, the application packages are all the same. It won't have the list of AppVert because we can do of Apvert because we can do drivers and all that stuff. And by the way, if someone toasts a laptop, you hit, rollback, and it takes them back to yesterday in their personalization layer. So that's, that's kind of why I went here, was because of the layering technology, not necessarily because of VDI.
So is that still in the cards as far as the desktop management, even on the physical side, even in light of the fact that Type 1 hypervisors never took off?
Yeah, it's still something we want to do and we talk about all the time. Generally, the discussions are around, what platform does it land on? Because we're not in the business of making our own Type 1 or anything like that. Will Windows 8 change that? With its own built-in Hyper-V, maybe. Is it the right platform? Will the SDK and everything be there for us to automate it and do what we need to do? Who knows, right? It's not even there yet.
Because fundamentally, the Unidesk layering that's happening at the hypervisor level. So it's a hypervisor doing all this magic of melding all these sort of different disk images together.
Kind of. It's above that. So all the VMCs is disks attached. The actual merging of the disks is happening from within the drivers. We call it the CFS, the composite file system, that actually merges it. So, a little trick, you could actually go into a Unidesk desk and list the disk volumes, and you can see multiple disk volumes. But if you just go to Windows Explorer and double click on the C drive, all you see is a C drive. So it's actually kind of happening below the executing environment at the driver level, but above the hypervisor. So we can actually run our stuff on almost anything. Hypervisor-wise, we just have to write to their SDK to do copy files and stuff like that.
There's a bunch of questions that are coming in, and we'll get through these, but I'll interject one so you're mentioning hypervisor. Like, fundamentally, the hypervisor is technology agnostic. But one of the users is asking about Hyper-V support from the Unidesk product.
I don't have a time for that. It's actually the next major thing on the list. We're making an architectural change here right now that's going to really even allow for that to run. But we get asked about that all the time. We used to get asked about Zen Server a lot, and that has completely fallen off. We are actually getting pushed from customers asking about Hyper-V and from a couple of our bigger partners really wanting us to do it with Microsoft. So that'll probably happen. I don't have a timeline, like it's not going to pop out in July or anything, but it definitely is going to happen.
Is that it would make sense to probably target that for a Hyper-V v3, to work with Hyper-V v3. Yeah, there's so much buzz around that, and there's so much excitement that, Microsoft is going to get it right this time, or more right. I guess some people are using it now, but
and is it not a right market where, VMware has Composer, Citrix has Provisioning Server, Hyper-V has essentially, they've got some stuff going on with Quest, but it's not got a great adoption. So there's a more of an open market there than there even is with VMware or Citrix.
That's a good point because, yeah. So this layering stuff, and we'll get through some of these other questions that people are posting, and feel free to pop more into the chat room if you're listening. Let's take a step back, though, because my first exposure to this concept of layering was from Chetan at Atlantis Computing.
Atlantis.
Let's call it 4 years ago. And Atlantis was talking early on about this layering and how all these layers, different layers could be patched at different levels and then sort of combined into desktops and stuff. And there's a lot of logistical problems with that. And Atlantis since has gone on to not focus on layering but focus on performance. And Atlantis is doing they're doing fine as a company, but they sort of didn't go after that layering. And I think part of that was because this layering is just complex, because if you're changing things within layers, like maybe you swap out something at the desktop layer level and it now has files that conflict with a higher level layer, or user installs something and it writes into their layer, but then the desktop, there's components that need to be in the desktop layer that the user couldn't write or didn't persist. So my general fear about layering was that it was an amazing, awesome concept, and I want like crazy for it to work, but I'm just scared that it's too brittle and that the exceptions would add up. And at some point, I'm just like, well, F this. If I would have just gone to persistent desktops in the first place and then had like a SCCM or an Altiris, I wouldn't have to deal with any of this shit in the first place.
Yep. I used to worry about that a lot too. And actually, it's funny that the guys that wrote it and are one of our kernel engineers and our chief architect and Chris, our CTO, those guys noodled for a long time on the concept of because we stack layers. We're not just like Ringcube that goes on top of a block image. We've got layers on top of layers, all the way up to the personalization layer. And they noodled for a long time on all the conflict that could happen, right? And how do we resolve it? And they built stuff internally for layer priorities. We still, when you're creating layers, we still respect MSI rules and all that stuff. So all the stuff people are kind of used to using still works. The interesting thing was they even built in some stuff that administrators can use to change layer priorities. So, what am I going to do when app has DLL1 and this one has DLL2 and this one needs to overwrite that one? So we even put in stuff that users could flip-flop layer priorities if they needed to in the field. The funny thing is, like I said, I've been here 2.5 going on 3 years. I've used it twice in all my time here. And I've probably talked to every customer, demo or production that Unidesk has. And I've got customers, that 1,500, 2,000, 4,000 seats that have never used it.
So it's like when you say that users, I'm sorry, when you say that users can flip-flop it in the field, do you mean like the administrators or the actual end users?
The administrator, okay. I'm sorry, the administrator. So the conflict resolution is really, you're dead on, Brian. It's a big worry, and it's actually really important. You have to have the mechanisms underneath and actually be refining them, right? Because day one, they're not going to be perfect, but be refining them as you go to make sure that the desktop operates kind of as expected. And then we also put in another technology, someone in the list here asked a little bit about Ringcube. And I think this is where there's going to be some issues until Citrix works out a bridge between the block level provisioning and the Ringcube layer. We also put in a technology that administrators can override things in the personalization layer. So when someone does call up and says, hey, Office stopped working, that's all they know. They don't know that it was the stupid plugin they downloaded or whatever. An administrator checks a box, he looks at that desktop and checks a box and says, okay, override anything that they've done that's conflicted with the Office layer. So DLLs, registry entries, they've overwritten things, whatever, and it essentially overrides that way. We don't do it by default because, hey, they might have installed a plugin that replaces a DLL and it works just fine. So the idea is to be able to repair it when it happens really quick, but the key is the underlying system that allow these layers to merge and, like you said, not step all over each other.
Do those repairs happen on the fly, or are there reboots in between?
It depends. Typically, it's a reboot in between. Yeah, because if they installed something and it overwrote C program files common blah 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 .dll, we're just gonna, and it's a restart is exactly what it is. We call it punch through, where the app is basically punching through anything that the user has done. We eradicate their changes to those DLLs or registry entries, restart the machine, and it's back up to where it was. Now, nothing else they did was lost. The WinRAR they installed, their profile, the iTunes they have, all that stuff still there, but just anything directly conflicting with that specific app layer.
Okay.
So would you characterize my fear of layering as sort of not really
unfounded?
Maybe unfounded. Would you? Yeah.
You know what I would care? You know what I would liken it to? I would liken it to the early days of server virtualization, where everybody was worried. What if one server ate up all the resources on the host? Right. That was a big sweat. That's why no one wanted to move out of test. That's why you didn't move it out of the labs because, you don't understand. My server really, is there a potential for issues? Sure there is, right? But the underlying hypervisor in that case, they built the scheduling mechanisms and the throttling mechanisms so that if it was only given 2 vCPUs, it could only eat 2 cores and there were 20 other cores in the box, et cetera, et cetera. It's a valid thing to bring forward. If the technology has a way to handle it, then great, right? I don't think all the technologies have a great way to handle it. I think we have a pretty good way of handling it, and we continue to refine it. But it's a valid concern that we feel that we've addressed.
So there's a bunch of questions, and I don't know if you can I don't even know how to ask that. So I see Dan Brinkman and some anonymous people are just asking about sort of Unidesk versus Ringcube or AppSense or Winova and these other kinds of things. I don't know if you can even share any thoughts. I don't want to get into why one is
who's better, who's thumping chest. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I don't know. Well, what does Unidesk do that's really cool?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we first came out, and you guys even mentioned it, I pushed on user installed apps when we first came out because no one else was doing it. Which we can support the user installed apps. But the reason I pushed it was because we wanted a splash. And then you guys mentioned, hey, now you guys you're getting away from Persona, you're more doing apps and stuff. And I think that's the really cool thing is that we handle, the user installed apps and anything the user wants to do, but in the same interface and the same technology, the user doesn't have to go to any place else. He can package or layer his apps. And they don't have to learn anything, right? They don't have to learn about isolation or bubbles or do I have to link these two packages, these two bubbles so they can communicate or, I can't install Adobe, the full package, because I can't support drivers, right? So that's really been a big thing as of late, has really been the application stuff.
And you mentioned earlier that, fundamentally, there's nothing really preventing your stuff from working in a physical desktop environment, which I could extrapolate out to say if you can make it work in a physical environment, then it can work in sort of any virtual environment, client, hypervisor, streamed OS, any server platform. So if a company wanted to use a Unidesk for sort of all their Windows desktops in their environment, regardless of where those are, that's not there today, but sort of, would you call that on the roadmap, or would you call that on like the concept of what could happen in the future?
That's the long-term goal today. I mean, when we talk about it, we always talk about, we're in VDI today. You got to make your money somewhere, and that's where the change happens to be. But, the long-term goal would be to do this for desktops too, right? One management platform or interface for the end user that can do physical desktops also. And we get asked a lot about servers. Can you do server OSs? There's nothing technically that would keep us from doing server OSs. We just haven't put the focus on it and put the engineering time in on it, and we're probably not going to.
Imagine user installed apps for servers. The user in this case is like Joe Jr. admin.